Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, where we help new and beginning teachers navigate through those crazy first years of teaching so you can maintain your sanity and personal life. Here's your host, Kim Lapre.
Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, episode number 24. Hey, thanks for coming and hanging out with me today. I'm your host, Kim Lapre, and this is the podcast for new and beginning teachers who don't want to just survive those first few years, but actually thrive. Today, I have for you an amazing guest, Latisha Chisholm, and she is a special educator over in Washington, D.C., and we're going to discuss all things that have to do with IEPs and students with special needs in the mainstream classroom. So this is part of my series where I discuss the different types of data that you should be looking at in the beginning of the school year. And I definitely think that it's really crucial to look at those IEPs if you have students that have them. Now, there are a lot of implications when you have students with IEPs. It does mean that you have to make some adjustments. It definitely means that you have to pay attention to the accommodations and modifications and look at the goals that these students are supposed to be meeting. And it's a legal document that you don't want to just ignore. You want to definitely pay attention to it. So in my conversation with Latisha, we do dive into what teachers can do to help these students. And actually, these types of accommodations, they just end up being good teaching practices in general. So they're not difficult to do, but they are a requirement for your students with IEPs. So Latisha is going to be sharing her vast expertise on the realm of special education. And be sure to stick around until the end of the episode where I give you my top takeaways from all that Latisha teaches us during our interview. So here's my conversation with Latisha. Latisha, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, could you please tell my listeners about your teaching experience and how you came to your current position?
Absolutely. Well, I am a special education coordinator at Anacostia High School in Southeast Washington, D.C. And I actually began my career in schools as a school social worker. I'm a trained social worker, but while I was providing school social work, I really was inspired to kind of go into the classroom and later support teachers. So that's what I did. I went into a teacher training program and switched careers, became a special education and English teacher. And I did that for 4 years. And then I taught biology and environmental science.
Oh, wow.
And then I switched from being a teacher to being a special education coordinator, where I have been supported by my administration by now coaching teachers.
So you were definitely multi-passionate then.
Yes, absolutely.
I was just curious about your school. What are the demographics of the community you serve and those of the students in your school?
Well, our community is really interesting because it's actually fast changing. It's gentrifying really quickly, and one of the last kind of communities within DC to gentrify. So our community is becoming more and more diverse each year. Our student population, however, is probably 99% African American. And also 99 to 100% eligible for free and reduced lunch.
Okay. What makes your school unique and an ideal place for families to send their students?
Absolutely. So we are extremely proud of being a neighborhood school, a traditional public high school, and a community school. So with entrance into Anacostia, our families gain access to a full-service school-based health center that's run by Georgetown University Hospital. We have intellectual and career-oriented programs such as our Public Safety Academy, which prepares students for career in law enforcement and includes a Georgetown street law clinic. We have a computer science program, which has an awesome partnerships with the likes of Microsoft, Facebook, and other tech companies where students have built things like 3D printers, among other cool items. And then we have this new urban arts department, which is developing our student artists who sing, dance, produce visual art, etc. We have two powerhouse sports teams, including our multi-year championship-winning girls basketball and cheerleading teams. Those teams both are huge draws to students and parents. And then we have a full service mental health team with 7 social workers and 2 school psychologists who implement individual and group interventions, lead the school in restorative practices, and even offer music production that supports the overall mental health initiatives. And then finally, my program, I support the special educators at the school. One of our most sought after initiatives is actually our self-contained special education academy or pull-out academy. On one side of that academy, we offer independent living skills and such curriculum that would help students kind of transition into life, particularly those that are pursuing certificates of IEP completion rather than diplomas. And those that part of the academy services students with autism and intellectual disability. And then on the other side of our program, we have a full service offering for students with specific learning disability, emotional disabilities, and autism that are pursuing diplomas. There, we implement summit learning curriculum and pedagogy, where we offer a blended and individualized learning environment. There, we grade on a competency-based scale and focus on mastery of specific Common Core aligned skills. So lots of cool reasons.
I can definitely see why people would want to send their kids to your school. I mean, you guys have so many services that will appeal to every learner, whatever needs that each individual student has. And it just sounds like you guys are serving the whole child, not just, the academics, but also the mental and emotional side of that. And I think that's amazing.
Yes, but I'm so glad that you pulled out kind of that phrase of serving the whole child, because that's definitely kind of what our mission is to serve the whole child so we can prepare them for whatever their goal is next after high school, whether it be career or college oriented.
Right. And so they're prepared, it sounds like, with these skills, and they're going to be more resilient and have grit because they were nurtured not just, for academics or sports, but just so that they feel, it sounds like a family. Everyone's taking care of everyone.
Yeah. And that's what we hope. We hope that all of the families that come to our school really kind of feel enveloped by all of the love that we have to offer, all of the services that we have to offer, all of the advocacy that we want to walk side by side with them in doing for their child.
Now, you had mentioned that you support special educators. So what is your role in relation to the other special educators? Are you in the classroom with them, or are you helping them like on the outside support their students?
Right now, I am out of the classroom and I support special educators in 2 ways. So the first is with compliance around everything in alignment with IDEA, which is the special education law that kind of governs everything that we do. So as far as compliance and holding meetings, making sure IEPs are appropriate, checking all of those things. And then the second strand of my role is actually supporting the special educators in the school around instruction and the direct service that we offer to children. So that is through kind of pushing in classes and observing, co-planning with them, providing professional development around best practices, any of those things.
I did a series before about hiring new teachers, and it was with different principals and what their hiring practices are. And I'm just curious what you see at your school. What do you feel, or what do you think that your administrators, or even for you, if someone were coming into your department, what are you looking for in terms of someone who will fit into your school community and really thrive as a teacher?
Yeah, well, I think there are 2 huge things. First is this growth mindset, really. we find that teachers are more successful at working with students regardless of kind of what background the student comes from or what disability they might present with, if they truly believe that success is based on growth and not necessarily fixed. And then I think the other piece is coachability. You can work with anyone if they're willing to be coached up. Like you can help people develop into being awesome teachers if they just have this willingness and kind of drive to do it. And so those are the things that we're looking for when we look at new teachers.
Absolutely. I think sometimes new teachers worry about, am I going to answer the questions right? Am I going to describe a perfect lesson, in a way that makes me look good? But I feel like at the end of the day, you can teach them classroom management. You can teach them pedagogy and you can even help them know their content area better. But if they are fixed in terms of their own mindset or how they see the students, or if they already have it figured out, how teaching is going to happen, whether they're new or they're a veteran teacher, I feel like it's really hard to be successful in the classroom in general.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's definitely not about presenting yourself as perfect, because it's the job of the school administrators and instructional coaches to help develop you as this professional. So, looking for someone perfect or who thinks they have everything in order already is not really the priority. It's really that coachability and that growth mindset.
Now, okay, so let's say that I just got hired at your school. How are new teachers in your school informed about whether or not they have students with IEPs in their classes, like the mainstream students?
So all of our teachers, whether they're new or not, kind of have the same process for finding out. I, as a special education coordinator, like to make sure that all of our special educators have their full caseload assigned to them by the first day of pre-service week. And the reason why I have that assignment so early is so that they can get IEPs at a glance prepared for general educators within that first week. Because the goal is for all general educators to have a list of the students that are receiving special education services on day one, including kind of who that person's case manager is and whether or not they receive support services like behavior support. And then also giving them a link to a folder that has the students' IEPs at a glance available. And the IEPs at a glance are about a 2-pager of a synopsis of many of the most important things from the IEP. So we try to make sure that all of that is available within the first week of school, so that once teachers are moving on from kind of like getting to know you and classroom routines, they can really use that student information to start planning for the academic structure of their classroom.
They receive these, the IEPs, and I've seen those first 2 pages, and really, I'm grateful that's all that I get because some of them are pretty lengthy. But, when you think about the overwhelm of a first-year teacher, can you explain, what information IEPs contain and which parts they should focus on?
Absolutely. An IEP, like you say, an IEP is such a comprehensive document that it's not necessarily reasonable for any teacher to have every single student's entire IEP kind of memorized. So that is not the expectation. It's more important to kind of think about maybe the educational disability that the student qualifies for. So whether that's a specific learning disability or emotional disturbance, autism, etc. Because what a teacher can do is then either meet with a related service provider like a social worker or the special educator in the room to understand what are some of the common traits of those disabilities and kind of get a mental picture of the various kind of behavior concerns or academic concerns they might run into in class, because you really want to have kind of an overarching idea to kind of to contextualize some of the IEPs that you'll read. And then there is a section of the IEP that is about where the student is presently performing. And it's really important to kind of understand the student's present levels in your course. So if you're teaching math, you really want to know kind of where they're performing in math, what skills and abilities they've struggled with in the past, and where their strengths might be. And then similarly, if you are supporting them in reading or English, you want to also know kind of what their Lexile level is, what grade level they read on, where they struggle with comprehension. And so knowing their present levels is really important. Additionally, there are goals that are academic and related to the different services a student might get. And it's important to primarily know the goals that are associated with your class or that might affect your class. Because, you want to know what the special educator has been charged to work with the students on, because that might affect how she approaches your classroom assignments as it pertains to those students. And then I said, and then baseline data also. So baseline data shows you with relation to the goal that the student has, how are they currently performing? How have we seen them perform on this goal in the past? So if they have a writing goal, you also should see what we know about their writing so far and how close they are to completing this goal. So accommodations are really super important, because this is kind of what we're required to give students in order to help them access and progress in the general education curriculum. So accommodations are interesting because they're very similar to just good teaching practices. So it could be could be modification of assignments. It could be small group instruction. It could be like less choices on a multiple choice question. Or if someone has an incredibly low reading score, it could be like read aloud or things like that. So the accommodations kind of show you how you specifically might have to modify your lesson plans or assignments to accommodate a student and what they need to be able to access the material in your course.
Now, something I noticed on IEPs that always frustrated me, the goals would, I'd almost be like, they'd be passing the baton to me, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, I have to pick up these goals that are, they have to reach these goals by a point mid-year, like mid-school year for me. And I don't know where they are in terms of, well, how many times did they meet this? Sometimes it'll say they can do it 80% in 3 out of 4 trials or something like that. And I'm like, well, have they already done 2? Or how do I know where I am? And then with the accommodations, like you said, a lot of it is just good teaching. And so I wonder if maybe, do you ever find that those accommodations aren't even appropriate anymore by the time they get to you?
Sometimes that can happen. And I think it's important for us to realize that the IEP spans an entire academic year. And something that may have been appropriate kind of 8 months ago for a child, students are developing at rapid fire, in high school age or in any other age group, really. And so something that might have been appropriate for them 8 months ago, you may have enough data to support that they don't need that accommodation anymore. And it's really just important to actually have the data that supports that thought or idea, and then make sure that it's communicated to the special educator that is their case manager, because when they go to either, they can modify the IEP if it's needed, but when they go to write it again, you want to make sure that those accommodations don't continue if you have the evidence that proves that the student no longer needs those accommodations, because that's the goal. The goal is to only provide enough accommodations for the student to be able to progress. And then once you realize that they have, built up that muscle that the accommodation was trying to help, you pull the accommodation away so that the students are more empowered to use the muscle that you've helped them develop through education.
Right. So it's the least restrictive environment, because if we hold their hand too much, then they'll be like learned helplessness, or they'll depend on us too much anyway.
Exactly. And our goal is to prepare them to be self-sustaining learners and citizens. And so we have to be very particular about how we kind of scaffold that process.
And I feel like it's even more urgent in high school to really prepare them, because you only have 4 years with them and then they're off to the real world. That's it. If they didn't get everything by that point, that's it.
Exactly.
Right?
It's over. And then the IEP is until you're 18. And you might be lucky at some colleges where they might give some accommodations or modifications, but they're not legally required in the same way that high schools are. So it's really important that we don't over scaffold, don't over accommodate, and really kind of pull them back as we're getting the data that shows us that students don't need what they don't need.
I've actually had parents ask me if they have IEPs and accommodations in college, and I didn't really know how to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of thought that once you leave high school, or reach 18, you're kind of on your own. I don't think that universities are required to do anything. It's sort of like, well, you've made it to the university.
They're not required to, but you will find that many universities have places where students who had IEPs can go and advocate for certain things. Like students can get note takers or maybe extended time on a test or something like that, but it is not even close to what they were able to get and legally required to get at the high school level.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So if I'm looking at the IEP and I'm looking at the accommodations, what are the typical types of accommodations that are expected from me that will actually help, that new teachers can use, so that it's not too overwhelming, where they don't feel like they have to do something completely different, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think a small group instruction is one that's common and shouldn't feel amazingly cumbersome to new teachers, because many of them will be familiar with like station rotation models or other types of co-teaching models where you can kind of break the class into smaller groups. Another might be to modify class assignments. And so this also doesn't mean recreating the wheel after you have created a lesson. It may just mean if you have a document that you want students to work through and everybody has to do like 5 different sections, you may have 3 sections for some kids or 4 sections for some kids. It might also be things like a graphic organizer, where you're giving students a writing assignment and you chunk that, their assignment into graphic organizer. That may include either, like I said, chunked opportunities where they have to do, step 1 before having a check-in with you, or they may have sentence starters. And these are all things that don't require you to kind of like reinvent your entire lesson for a group of students, but really is just kind of an accommodation that you have in your pocket for the students who need it based on the data that you have about those students. Those are, and then extended time. So some students may just need more flexible scheduling from you, particularly when it comes to tests and things like that. Students may need more time to work on those. And that's just a matter of either providing flexible opportunities for them to take the assessment, or getting the assistance of, a co-teacher or something like that to pull them out into a different environment where they can test. Those are pretty common. Sometimes you have preferential seating, and that may be just you being very intentional about the seating structure in class and making sure that students have kind of seating that is either closer to you or around less distractions, etc.
Like you said, those just sound like different strategies that are involved in good teaching in general. So it just sounds like you're just more intentional with making sure that the needs of those students with IEPs are met, but not in a way that also draws negative attention to them. I'm sure, especially at the high school level, they don't want someone to bring attention to their disability or the fact that they need these extra services.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point because you definitely don't want to ostracize kids or make them think that having an IEP is something that's negative, because it's definitely not. And so some of the ways that you can kind of address those is to treat your lesson planning as a good practice for everyone. So there may be modifications that you have for a student that is on an IEP that you also provide to some students, other students in your class who you have data that shows, this is a portion of an essay that students were struggling on. And so those 7 students in the class, regardless of an IEP, are going to get this support. Then everyone in the class understands that we all have some strengths and some areas of concern, and our instruction will be changed based on those needs that we have. And it's not necessarily like just because a student has an IEP that they're going to get some kind of special treatment, but rather as the teacher for the entire class, you're looking at how to make it as individualized a process as possible, meeting students' needs. I think additionally, this speaks to the importance of, if you do have a co-teacher that's a special educator, that they don't just relegate themselves to just working with students receiving special education services, because then that kind of like, I don't know, makes their role a little diminished in the classroom, and also puts a spotlight on the students that they're working with, rather than having this kind of co-teaching model where both of us can be lead teachers at various times. Both of us can play supportive roles. Both of us can lead stations during station rotation. Both of us can do all of these things, so that we're just the teachers in this classroom. It's not, one that works with special kids and one that doesn't. So all of those things are super important.
And it's interesting because you brought this up, where a lot of times the non-IEP kids also need the same help. And I think there might even be a stigma that if you have an IEP, it means that you're performing below grade level. And we both know that that's not true. And in fact, there have been times, where I had to catch myself because I thought that a student, in the beginning of the year had an IEP because of how they were performing. But no, they don't have an IEP. They're just reading and writing below grade level. So I think sometimes we have to watch our assumptions that we make about students with disabilities, in this case, students that are being mainstreamed and have IEPs.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely cannot assume that any student with an IEP doesn't have the same skills and abilities as other students, or cannot produce at the same level as other students can. Because, I mean, think about extended time and the difference it can make giving think time to a student who has a slower processing speed, where if you're not giving them the time that they need, you're not getting the answers from them ever. And it's kind of like, wow, like they're really not retaining anything that I'm teaching, versus if you give them the accommodation of extended time that they need because of whatever processing concerns they may have, suddenly you're like, whoa, this student actually retains everything and extends the stuff that I give them. And so they definitely don't have any problem producing at the level that I'm asking them to. It's a matter of that small accommodation that suddenly allows them to express what they know in the best way they can.
I had a student like that a couple of years ago who, when he was working with groups, I could tell that they thought that he just struggled more than others. They thought that maybe he wasn't at great level. But when you read his writing, I mean, he just took at least twice as long on a writing assignment than anyone else. But when you really gave him that time, his writing was beautiful.
Yes.
And, that was a learning experience for me. It was like, you know what, I really need to give him the time and space to write, because he's performing above grade level.
Absolutely.
And he's exceeding everyone's expectations. But, especially I teach middle school, kids are impulsive. They want to move on. They're impatient.
Yes.
But I think that, obviously as teachers, we have to be the ones who are calling the shots and just know, like, so for that student, if we had like an essay and I knew that other people would get done earlier, then obviously he would get the separate setting because he needed that extra time
Yes.
to produce the work.
Yeah.
So it makes all the difference.
I think that's an awesome example.
And then, so, I touched on this a little bit, actually, both of us, in terms of myths and misconceptions that many teachers have about students with the IEPs or 504s. Now, considering that you are a special education teacher, what do a lot of teachers come in terms of the assumptions that they have, or have you run into teachers who don't quite understand it, or maybe just don't think that all of this, accommodations and stuff is necessary?
For the most part, working with the students and giving them that direct service while teaching convinces most teachers that some kind of modification or accommodation is necessary. So I don't think that is the particular concern. I think that sometimes it's difficult for teachers to see accommodations and modifications as just good teaching strategies also. And so a mistake that general educators can make is assuming that only the special educator is supposed to be thinking about these things, when really you kind of get the best result when both teachers are putting their heads together, or even a team of teachers are putting their heads together and kind of throwing out ideas from their toolboxes for how to best accommodate or modify assignments, tests, classroom structures. So that's one. I think that the idea that you have to create like a whole different lesson plan lesson plan for students that receive special education services is a big one, because it just seems so cumbersome. Like, what are you saying? I have to do my original lesson plan and do 3 other versions of it just to service all of the IEPs in my class? And it's like, absolutely not. Please don't do that. Like, you're just going to burn out and leave the teaching profession if that's what you believe and that's what you push yourself to do. We don't want you to do that. We want to figure out how to think work smarter and not harder, and like small modifications to the plan that you have, and to maybe either the product that students have to produce or the input that you give them will do wonders for students with special education services. You should be able to look at multiple IEPs in a class and bucket their needs, because many students will have very similar needs. And so where you're like, oh my gosh, I have 15 IEPs in this class, what the heck am I going to do? You might have 15 IEPs, but then there's really only 3 buckets of specific needs based on whatever lesson that you're providing. And so you just have to change 3 things and provide, 3 different versions of, a worksheet that's guiding them through, their project or something like that to get the results that you need to get from students. So I definitely think that myth about lessons. I think you also touched on a huge one, which is that all students with IEPs are performing significantly below grade level. That is just not the case. It really is not the case. And honestly, the IEP is just a document about what the school has to provide in order to help the student access and progress in the general education setting. And so it may, like, even though a student may need accommodations or modifications, that doesn't mean it's because they can't perform at grade level. It just means that they need this assistance in order to move towards or continue to perform at grade level. So it's definitely a huge misconception that students with IEPs will not be able to perform at grade level.
Now, have you had resistance to some of the accommodations, like extra time? I know that, I hear that in high school, some teachers are really strict with their deadlines and they don't allow for anyone to turn in late work. Or do you run into that where you get pushed back in terms of honoring the IEP?
I do think that we get pushback, particularly in a school like mine where we have like a large kind of self-contained or pull-out academy where sometimes the conversation is, well, are we modifying so much that they just need to go to this other classroom and get their instruction there? And that's a really difficult conversation for me because, like you said earlier, at the high school age, we're actually trying to reverse that trend. And we should be trying to push students out of self-contained and back into mainstream education, because that's the world they're about to enter, and we're preparing them for a world where you are mainstreamed. There's not anything special for you unless you're so severe that people can't really ignore it. So yeah, I would say that sometimes there is pushback around the extent to which a mainstream classroom should have to modify or accommodate for a student, and at which point a student just needs to be pulled out into a different setting. And I think that there's so much nuance and tension around that topic that it becomes a really hot topic for IEP teams to determine where is the best place for this child to get the education that they deserve.
And sometimes parents too. I've had experience with parents not wanting, additional services for their students, where the IEP team felt that they're just struggling too much in a mainstream classroom. So there's that, discussion of what's the best placement for that student, and it just really depends on the point of view from which you're looking at it. And so I can imagine that would be tough too. Do you ever have parents who either want more or fewer services and what you guys recommend?
Yeah, I think we get it both. I think we get both ways, where we have parents that want more services and parents that want less services. And it really just has to boil down to the data. One is a huge predictor. We have to have the data to support one or the other decision, particularly when it comes to least restrictive environment. We are legally bound to provide special education services in the least restrictive environment. And so unless we have data that proves that the child cannot make progress in that environment, it is literally illegal for us to move them to a more restrictive environment. So I think the data is hugely important. As I told you before, my school obviously has a strong sense of the whole child and supporting like the social emotional needs of a child. And so that often comes into play also, where like we may have a student that academically is ready to be mainstreamed. However, socially and emotionally, it would be like really jarring for them. And so I'm thinking of a student where we have slowly kind of lowered his hours every year of high school in order to mainstream him kind of like extremely slow. So we wouldn't have to deal with the social implications for him that might actually mess up his academic progress. So we do have, some of those concerns that pop up in addition to disagreements within the IEP team, and maybe sometimes the parent disagreeing with the school or various members of the school disagreeing with one another about what's best. It's really, it's super important. I mean, those team meetings are really important, and bringing data to the table is really important. And then thinking about the whole child and what's really going to be best for the whole child is also super important.
We had talked about goals earlier, especially when you're talking about what's appropriate in those IEP team meetings. So in setting goals for those meetings, what type of information can the classroom teachers collect to make those goals more relevant or to help you guys out in terms of setting future goals for the students?
I think it's really helpful actually when classroom teachers have portfolios of student work. It's really important to actually have student work that we can look at to determine how a student is progressing. Definitely all of the data on diagnostic local assessments, like the SRI and the MAP and things like that. Bigger assessment scores like PARC or whatever kind of state exams that you have. and the rubrics that are associated with those so that we can kind of analyze where students are. And then any data that relates to the specific goals they already have on their IEPs. Because in order for us to kind of change a goal on an IEP, we have to prove that the student has mastered it. And in order to prove that the student has mastered it, we come to you and we say, hey, this is their goal. Where are they on this goal? How are they performing? How do we know how they're performing? And you guys, as general educators, kind of help us come up with a picture of, has the student reached this goal or not? And then if they haven't reached the goal, then we need to kind of determine why they haven't reached the goal, what else they might need. So data on the modifications and accommodations that you provide them and how they respond to those, as we were talking about earlier when discussing making sure we're not over accommodating or over modifying. It's important for you to note for us. I no longer have to give, Jasmine a graphic organizer when she writes essays because she has that skill down. So that no longer has to be on her IEP. So definitely things that we no longer need based on, how the student is performing in your class is super important. And then I know, and I don't know if all states do this, but I know in DC, our goals are aligned to standards, local standards, or in our case, the Common Core standards. But any kind of like standards-based data is important too. So any kind of standards that they have mastered already, so we don't need to worry about those, or standards that we're like, no, like this person needs to continue developing those standards. Those are all kind of really important pieces of information that special educators could use to write better IEPs.
So do you meet with the classroom teachers ahead of time so that they know, do you know what I mean? Like in the beginning of the year, do they know to sort of keep track of the work? I don't know if you guys do it electronically, like if you're a one-to-one school, or if you ask for just like, hey, can you pull aside the essays of these students so I can keep track of it?
I think in the best world, those are all things that you want to do, everything that you kind of suggested. At our school, we have academies. And so each academy has at least 2 special educators on the team. And the goal is for those special educators to communicate with the general educators about the type of student work and data that would be important. And then when we put the IEP meetings on our calendars, all of the general educators are invited too. So they don't have to attend, but they know that they're definitely going to be tapped for an update on the student, even if it's a written update because they can't make it to the meeting. And then if they do come to the meeting, they often will bring the student portfolios with them to show the team kind of this is the work that the student is producing in my class with these accommodations and modifications.
So I think the more intentional you are about collecting that data on those students, and it's not really that hard, actually, even if you just make a quick, in the past when I used to do paper, I would just make a quick photocopy of their work because the students want their work back. So I'll just, keep like a file folder, and it's really not that hard. And at the end of the day, it's best for them. I mean, I need them to progress in my class. And I feel like the case carrier can't do their job in terms of tracking that goal if I'm not giving them any data to work with or any student work, to look at.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up great points. One about how it's not that difficult to help to keep track of student work. And it's another one of those teaching best practices. I mean, it's just a best practice to keep student work so you have evidence of the progress that they've made in your class, whether or not they have an IEP. So I think that's another one of those good teaching practices. And when it comes to participation in IEP meetings, just remembering that this is a legal process that outlines the rights of students and the responsibilities of schools. And you are the educational professional in the room. it's our job to do the best that we can to inform the team and the parents about what we think as professionals is the best next step for their child. And then once we put it on paper, we're legally bound to it for the next year. You know what I mean? So I think that
it's a contract.
Yes, I think it's incredibly important. And I think that people should take it seriously. It shouldn't paralyze you, because it really is just a culmination of you implementing really good teaching practices, including that keeping data on your students and knowing your students and being able to speak specifically to their progress or lack thereof. But it definitely should not be kind of taken with a grain of salt or flippantly. It should be, prepared for.
Right.
Yeah.
Just to wrap things up here, what else do you think new teachers should know about mainstreaming students with special needs?
Well, we've talked about so much. I think that there's definitely just so much to pull from this conversation. But one thing I would say is students with IEPs who have been in kind of a pull-out or self-contained setting and are moving into mainstream settings are nervous. And it's important that we give them a blank slate to really integrate into our classroom, because it's a huge deal to come from an environment where you were learning with only other students receiving special education services to having to be with your peers at a time when your peers are so important. And so it's really on the job of the adults to make sure that those students have every opportunity to succeed in the general education setting. And just kind of keeping in mind, as we've touched on multiple times, that we're preparing these students for a world where they're not going to have pull-out services, where they're not going to have self-contained services. And we really want to prepare them. And so that may mean, a little bit extra from us, particularly when they're first transitioning from pull out to mainstream, because they've been used to a different kind of educational setting. That those early kind of, small failures and things like that do not mean that the IEP team has made a mistake and that the student cannot succeed in your class. It really just means that we have to give some little wins to build their confidence so that they are also convinced that they can succeed in your class. So, I think that's really important. And then just really relying on that team. There's a team there for a reason. A team meeting can be called at any time. And it can just be to conference about a student, leaning on the special educators who are charged to be experts in what these students need.
Right.
And I mean, just remembering that all of our students deserve and are required to be taught in the least restrictive environment. And, you're lucky if the least restrictive environment is your class, and the students should feel like you're confident about your ability to teach them and their ability to learn, and that if there are things that you need in order to be able to teach them better, that you're willing and able to reach out to the supports within the school system to help make sure that they're getting your best.
Well, thank you so much, Latisha. Oh my goodness. You're right. We have covered so much in the episode today. And I know that my listeners are going to probably have to go and take notes on this because there's just a lot of, like I said, misconceptions, and I'm sure some eye-opening things that we discussed that they didn't really know about or felt too embarrassed to ask about, especially as new teachers. So where can, my listeners get a hold of you if they want to contact you?
Absolutely. So I'm always available on Twitter at Miss L Chisholm. Additionally, my school has social media accounts. Our website is anacastiahs.org. And our social media account on Twitter is at Anacostia High. So would always be willing, happy, and open to questions, follow up, whatever.
Awesome. And I'll be sure to put those links in the show notes and on the podcast website for you guys listening here. Well, thank you again, Latisha. I really appreciate it, and for you giving us so much valuable information.
Thank you for having me, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, guys, did you catch all of that? Because I knew that Latisha was totally going to bring it in terms of the value and wisdom on all the things that have to do with IEPs and special education. So here are the main takeaways from this conversation, and there are quite a few. A big one is that accommodations and modifications for special ed students, they're just really good teaching strategies. So things like small group instruction and repeating directions, things like that, we should be doing that anyway. And so this is just something that it's a myth that it's going to be really hard to implement these strategies into our teaching. But honestly, I think most of us are doing this anyway. You just want to be more intentional about it to ensure that the needs of your IEP students are met. Also, the point of these accommodations is to allow students' strengths to really shine outside of their disability. So they may have like a slower processing time than other students, but once they do have the opportunity and once you do give them that accommodation, they really show you what they can do. So it's actually in their best interest and in your best interest to implement these accommodations. Now, this means that you're not going to create a new lesson plan. You're just going to make small modifications to the plan that you already have in terms of maybe the product that you expect them to produce or even the different inputs that you give them. Now, a mistake that some general education teachers can make is that they think that only the special education teachers need to think about accommodations or collecting student work and data, but actually, that's not really going to be impactful for your students. What you need to do is work with them and try to come up with ways that you can best serve these students in your classroom so that they can reach their goals. So one way that Latisha had mentioned doing this was to look at the IEPs for all of those students, and then you can bucket their needs, meaning some students need this type of accommodation, and so you're going to do it for just those students. Other students are going to need something like a separate testing environment, while another set of students needs something read out loud to them, or they need to use text to speech. So this actually makes it easier so that you can compartmentalize the needs of the students and the types of accommodations that you need to make. One important point that we spent a lot of time talking about is the fact that teachers shouldn't assume that students with IEPs perform below grade level. And I had even admitted that was something that I had done earlier in my career, and the students proved me wrong. And I really love that I was proven wrong because it opened my eyes to the fact that these are just kids who are learning in a different way. They need a little bit of extra help so that they can access grade level material. And it really has nothing to do with their intelligence or IQ at all. So that's something that we need to erase from any types of myths or bias that we have about students with IEPs. Also, Latisha had suggested that teachers keep class portfolios for students. That way, when they're having the IEP meetings and setting goals, they can have data so that they can set appropriate goals. So, for example, if one of the goals on the IEP is for them to read at a 6th grade level and they've already met that, then teachers can go ahead and reset that goal for something else. Or if in math, students need to explain how they solved a problem 4 out of 5 times, and you have evidence that they do that consistently, well, then they can move on to a different goal, or maybe they don't even need a math goal anymore. Latisha had also emphasized that teachers need to rely and lean on the special education team. They are there to help you best serve the students with IEPs. And if in any way you're unsure of what you should be doing, you're unsure of how to handle certain situations with these students, you definitely need to reach out because they're not necessarily going to know that you need the help. So just like in any case as a new teacher, you should reach out to administrators and other staff to help you. But especially if you have students with IEPs and this is your first year of teaching, you're not necessarily going to know what to do and what you're responsible for taking care of. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. I know that I got so much out of it. And if I was a first year teacher listening to this episode, it would clear up so much about what I need to do with my students with IEPs. Now, for those of you who are in your first couple of years of teaching and you haven't really thought about collecting data, I did create a really simple resource to help you figure out who is holding the data, who are the gatekeepers of the data, so that you can remember year after year who you have to go to. Sometimes the data is given to you, like demographic data, as I mentioned in episode number 23. And sometimes you have to go out and find it yourself. So this is just a simple data collection resource, and you can get it at teachersneedteachers.com/24. So if you did enjoy this episode and you don't want to miss out on any more, go ahead and hit on that subscribe button. And even better, if you could share the love and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues who could benefit from the information and the wisdom of people like Latisha. Also, if you want to get a hold of me to be on the show, or you want to further discuss anything that was mentioned in the show today, you can reach me at kim@teachersneedteachers.com. Have a fabulous week.
Thanks for listening to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast. Love this episode? Head over to Apple Podcast or Google Play to subscribe, rate, and leave a review.